There is a small brass lock in a museum in New York. It is not behind glass. Most visitors walk past it. It sits in a case near other objects from the early 20th century. A ledger, a photograph, a piece of cloth faded to grey. The label next to the lock is short. It gives a date, a location, and a number. The number is 146. The lock came from the 9th floor of a building on the corner of Green Street and Washington Place in Lower Manhattan. It was found in the rubble after the fire. It had been locked from the outside. On the inside of that lock was a door. Behind the door was a stairwell. Behind the stairwell was the street, 30 feet below, and the fire was moving fast, and the door would not open. That is the object. That is what it did. Now here is the system that produced it. New York City in 1911 was the garment capital of the world. By some estimates, half of all clothing sold in the United States was manufactured on the island of Manhattan. The industry employed somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 workers, depending on the season, concentrated in a band of Lower Manhattan, running from the blocks around Washington Square north toward what would eventually become the Fashion District. The buildings were stacked, 8 floors, 10 floors, 12 floors. Inside each floor, hundreds of machines. Inside each machine, a worker. The noise was constant. The air was never clean. The fabric dust settled into the lungs over years and stayed there. The workers understood this. They had no other option that paid. The Triangle Waste Company occupied the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the Ash Building at 23 to 29 Washington Place. By 1911, it was one of the largest manufacturers of shirtwaists in the city. The women's blouse that was the dominant fashion of the era. The garment that every working woman and middle-class woman wore. The product that made the industry its fortune. The Triangle employed approximately 500 workers. Most of them were women. Most of them were recent immigrants from Italy and Eastern Europe. Jewish women from the Pale of Settlement, Catholic women from Sicily and Naples, young women who had arrived at Ellis Island with nothing and found work at a machine because the machine did not require English. Many were teenagers. Some were younger than that. The average age on the floor was 19. The work was piecework. You were paid by the garment, not by the hour. Faster hands meant more money. Slower hands meant less money and a look from the floor supervisor that communicated itself regardless of language barriers. The cost of needles was deducted from wages. The cost of thread was deducted from wages. The cost of electricity was deducted from wages. Workers were expected to arrive before the official start of the shift, already seated and threading their machines when the clock started. Time not at the machine was time not earning. There were nominal breaks at noon. In practice, the breaks lasted as long as the supervisor permitted, which depended on the day and the week's quota and the mood of the man standing at the end of the floor with a clipboard. There was no guaranteed minimum wage. There was no overtime that carried legal weight. You worked as long as the building was open and the machines were running. When the owners wanted a Saturday shift, they ran a Saturday shift. March 25, 1911, was a Saturday. The two owners were Isaac Harris and Max Blanck. They had emigrated from Eastern Europe. They had been poor. They had built a business from a single rented machine and understood the garment industry completely. The margins, the seasons, the buyers, the labor market, the precise calibration of wages and hours that produced maximum output at minimum cost. They were not unusually cruel men. In the garment industry of 1911 New York, they were thoroughly typical. They were wealthy enough by 1909 to live uptown, far from Washington Place, to employ household staff, to keep lawyers on retainer, to make the kinds of political donations that kept the relevant inspectors from looking too carefully or for too long. By 1909, the conditions in the garment factories had produced enough accumulated pressure that it finally released. The strike of that year, the uprising of the 20,000, began at Triangle. The immediate cause was the dismissal of workers who had attended union meetings. The broader cause was everything else: the wages, the hours, the mandatory bag inspections at the end of each shift, where every worker passed single file through one supervised door while a manager checked her bag for stolen fabric, the fines deducted for minor infractions, the fire exits that were locked during the day to prevent unauthorized breaks, the fire escapes that had never been tested at capacity. The workers called a mass meeting at Cooper Union. Clara Lemlich, 23 years old, had already been beaten on a picket line and had ribs broken. She stood up at the meeting and interrupted a speaker who was being careful about whether a full general strike was advisable. She spoke in Yiddish. She moved for an immediate general strike. The hall voted. Within days, 20,000 workers across hundreds of garment factories were out. Harris and Blanck responded the way employers of their era and industry responded. They hired guards. They paid police to arrest picketers. They paid women, in some accounts, women from the city's brothels, to walk provocatively near the picket lines so that the female strikers could be arrested for solicitation. Newspaper reporters covering the strike documented this openly and found it remarkable, if not surprising. The magistrates who processed the arrested strikers told them, from the bench, that they were on the side of the owners. One magistrate said this using exactly those words. Other factory owners eventually negotiated and signed agreements with the union. Harris and Blanck did not. They agreed to small wage increases. They refused union recognition. They refused the safety provisions. They refused to unlock the exit doors during working hours. The strikers at Triangle went back to work under the same conditions, with marginally more money and the same locked exits. The owners were satisfied. 16 months later, the building caught fire. On the afternoon of Saturday, March 25, 1911, approximately 500 workers were on the upper 3 floors of the Ash building, completing the week's last shift. The workday was nearly over. Some workers were gathering their things. The machines were still running. Someone, investigators spent months on this question and never definitively answered it, dropped a lit match or a cigarette into a bin of fabric scraps beneath a cutting table on the 8th floor. In the garment industry, fabric scraps were produced in enormous quantities. Long bolts of cloth were measured and cut to pattern on long tables, and the offcuts, the pieces that didn't fit any pattern, the thread waste, the tissue paper used as pattern templates, fell into bins beneath the tables. The bins were supposed to be emptied regularly. The schedule slipped. The bin under the cutting table on the 8th floor of the Triangle Waste Company on March 25, 1911, held weeks of accumulated cotton waste, thread, lace, tissue paper. The fire caught in seconds. Within 1 minute, it had reached the ceiling. The building was full of everything fire needs: cotton and linen fabric in bolts along the walls, wooden furniture, machine oil soaked into the floors, gas jets for lighting, tissue paper patterns hanging on lines above the cutting tables. The National Fire Protection Association had been recommending sprinkler systems in factory buildings since 1895. New York State had a law requiring sprinkler systems in buildings over 7 stories. The Ash building was 10 stories. The sprinkler requirement applied. The building had no sprinklers. Inspectors who had visited the building had noted the absence and had not required installation on the reasoning that the building's concrete and steel construction made it sufficiently fireproof. The building was fireproof. Its contents were not. The fire on the 8th floor was visible from the street within 2 minutes. Within 3 minutes, it had reached the windows and the ceiling. The workers on the 8th floor understood what was happening fast enough to act. The floor connected to an interior stairwell and to a freight elevator, and the alarm was raised quickly among those nearby. The bookkeeper on the 8th floor, a woman named Dinah Lifshitz, called the owner's office on the 10th floor on the building's internal telephone and warned them. The warning got through. Harris and Blanck were there that afternoon. Their families were visiting, as they sometimes did on Saturdays. The 10th floor had roof access. Students at New York University in the adjacent building reached across to the roof and helped pull people over. Harris and Blanck and their children and the workers on the 10th floor made it out. Most of them. The 9th floor received no call. This was not contested at trial. Lifshitz testified that she called the 10th floor. No one produced evidence that anyone called the 9th. Whether this was an oversight, equipment failure, or the chaos of the moment was never established. The result was that the approximately 250 workers on the 9th floor learned the building was on fire from the smoke and the heat and the noise, not from any warning. By the time they were moving toward the exits, the fire had traveled up through the elevator shafts and was already at the stairwell openings. There were 2 stairwell doors on the 9th floor. The Green Street stairwell was accessible. That door was unlocked. Workers who opened it found smoke, and within seconds, flames coming up from below. Some went through, some came back. The workers who entered the Green Street stairwell had varying outcomes depending on timing. Some survived, some did not. The Washington Place stairwell was the safer route. It connected to a separate exit shaft, away from the direct path of the rising fire. Workers who reached the Washington Place door found it locked. The key was with the floor supervisor, a man named Joseph Wexler. Wexler had already left the building for the day. The key was with him. The door did not open. This is the lock that is in the museum, not a metaphor. That specific lock, found in the rubble, is in a case in a museum in New York. The freight elevator operator, Joseph Zito, made 4 trips into the burning building. He drove the elevator car up to the 9th floor 4 times and brought workers down. Each trip, the car was loaded beyond its designed capacity. On the 4th trip, the heat had warped the elevator shaft enough that the mechanism was beginning to fail. Zito made the 4th trip aware of this. He brought the car down. Workers who could not fit into the car on that last trip, who were still at the shaft opening when the car descended, jumped onto the roof of the elevator car. Zito could feel them. Several workers who jumped missed the car roof entirely. Zito survived the fire. He testified about it. A journalist present at the testimony noted that his voice did not break during the account. He described each trip up and each trip down and what he saw at the shaft opening on each trip, and his voice did not break. The fire escape on the Washington Place exterior was a single iron structure. Its rated capacity was not designed for the number of people on the upper floors of a factory with 500 workers. Workers who reached the fire escape found it crowded immediately. They found something else at the bottom. The structure ended at the 2nd floor, approximately 12 feet above a concrete courtyard. There was no ladder to the ground. There was no connection to any surface that could be reached safely. This gap between the fire escape terminus and the ground had existed since the building was constructed in 1901. Inspectors had visited the building multiple times in the decade since its construction. None of the inspection reports on record documented the gap or flagged it as a deficiency. Workers reaching the bottom of the fire escape in the late afternoon of March 25, 1911, discovered it at the moment when going back up was no longer possible. The structure eventually buckled and partially collapsed under the weight and the heat. The windows on the 9th floor faced Washington Place. They were large windows. The building was designed with generous windows on the upper floors because the factory work required light. Workers began appearing in the windows within 4 or 5 minutes of the fire starting on the 8th floor. The street below was already crowded with people who had seen the smoke. The fire department arrived at 4:45 p.m. Chief Edward Croker was on scene within minutes. The department's longest ladders extended to the 6th floor. The fire was on the 9th. There was no equipment in the New York City Fire Department's inventory in 1911 that could bridge the difference between the 6th floor and the 9th floor of a building in Lower Manhattan. The firefighters extended their ladders to the 6th floor. They held their nets below the windows. The nets were designed for jumps from the 3rd or 4th floor. A person falling 9 stories, roughly 90 feet, impacts with a force that canvas held by human hands cannot absorb. This was understood by the firefighters at the scene within the first minute. They continued to hold the nets. There was nothing else to hold. The witnesses on the street included journalists, passers-by, delivery workers, residents of the neighborhood, and a 26-year-old woman named Frances Perkins, who had been having tea with a friend nearby when she heard the engines and walked to Washington Place. She stood on the sidewalk for the entire duration of the fire. She watched the workers in the windows. She watched what happened next. She watched the nets tear. She stood there for 18 minutes, and she remembered it, as she said herself in speeches and interviews decades later, for the rest of her life. She used the word never to describe the extent to which it left her. She did not appear to be speaking loosely. 18 minutes after it started, the fire was out. It had consumed the fuel available on 3 floors of a garment factory and then run out of material. The ash building was structurally intact. The concrete floors, the steel columns, the masonry walls, none of it burned. The building passed its post-fire structural inspection within an hour. The contents of 3 floors had been destroyed. The bodies were still being removed when the structural report was completed. 146 people died. 123 of them were women and girls. 23 were men. The youngest victim identified by name was Rosaria Maltese, who was 14 years old. Several of the dead could not be identified, too badly burned, or recovered in conditions that made individual identification impossible. They were buried together in a common plot in Brooklyn. The city organized a procession. 100,000 people walked in the rain. The streets of the Lower East Side held as many people as the streets could hold, standing on both sides watching the coffins pass. The cause chain, assembled afterward, had no complicated links. There was a point of origin, the fabric scraps. There was a fuel supply, 3 floors of production material in a building without suppression systems. There was an exit that was locked, a fire escape that didn't reach the ground, ladders that didn't reach the floor, an elevator that made 4 trips and stopped, windows 90 feet above the street. Every element of the chain had a prior cause, and every prior cause had a name or a policy number or an inspection report attached to it. None of the prior causes were hidden. None of them required forensic investigation to find. They were in plain sight, documented, reported, and unaddressed. The city's Fire Prevention Bureau had inspected the building. The State Labor Department had inspected the building. In 1910, a city official named Robert Adamson had completed a comprehensive survey of Manhattan factory buildings and submitted a written report to the appropriate city offices. The report identified, by name and address, buildings with insufficient fire escapes, absent sprinkler systems, locked exit doors during working hours, and exit capacity inadequate for their occupancy. The ash building's conditions were precisely those described in Adamson's report. The report was received, filed, and acted upon in no way. Adamson was not called to testify at the trial of Harris and Blanck. His report was not introduced as evidence. Harris and Blanck were indicted in April 1911 on charges of manslaughter in the 1st and 2nd degree. The charge was specific. The owners had established and enforced the policy of locking the Washington Place stairwell door during working hours, and this policy had directly caused the deaths of the workers who could not escape through it. Multiple surviving workers testified to the policy. Former employees testified to it. The union organizers from the 1909 negotiations testified that unlocking the exit doors had been one of the specific safety demands the owners had refused, and that Harris and Blanck had refused it explicitly and in writing. The factory's own procedures, the single exit inspection system, in which all workers left through one supervised door while a manager checked each bag for stolen fabric, required by its design that all other doors be locked during the shift. The policy was not hidden. It was not an informal understanding. It was a stated operational procedure that had been in place for years and that had been described in testimony during the 1909 labor negotiations by both sides without contradiction. The prosecution's case was not complicated. The locked door existed. Workers had died because of the locked door. The owners had implemented the locking policy. The connection was direct. The public expected convictions. Several newspapers had already run editorials describing the acquittal before the verdict as unthinkable. The trial ran for 3 weeks in December 1911. The defense was handled by Max Steuer. He was, by the consistent accounts of contemporaries and subsequent legal historians, among the most technically skilled trial attorneys in New York, a man who understood juries with something close to engineering precision, who could identify the exact tolerance at which reasonable doubt became possible and work within it. Steuer's strategy was not to argue that the door was unlocked or that the policy didn't exist. It was to argue that the prosecution could not prove the owners personally knew the door was locked on the specific afternoon of the fire. The distinction was narrow, but it was the distinction the jury instruction required. His primary target was Kate Alterman, a surviving worker who had escaped through the Washington Place door when another worker produced a key that existed, that worked, that opened the door, and who had stood near that door in the minutes before it opened and had watched and remembered what she saw there. Alterman had been present at the exact location that the prosecution's entire case depended on. She had witnessed the locked door, the workers pressing against it, the arrival of the key, and the opening. Her testimony was the most direct evidence of what had happened in the minutes before workers died on the 9th floor. Alterman testified about specific people at the door, their actions, the position of the door, the key, the moment it opened. Her account was detailed and internally consistent. Steuer had her repeat her testimony on cross-examination. He had her repeat it a 3rd time. Then he told the jury, methodically, that her description was phrased in nearly identical language on each repetition, that sentences appeared in the same order, that specific phrases recurred word for word. He argued that this was evidence of memorization, of a coached testimony, of a performance rather than genuine remembered experience. A woman who truly remembered would remember differently each time she told it. A woman who had been instructed what to say would say it the same way every time. The argument was effective. It did not address whether the door was locked. It did not address the policy. It planted the possibility that the jury's primary witness was unreliable, and the jury instruction required certainty. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Harris and Blanck were acquitted on all counts. The assistant district attorney who had prosecuted the case said afterward that he believed the verdict was wrong. He said this clearly. He was not in a position to do anything about it. The verdict was reported in neutral language. There were protests outside the courthouse. They were orderly. Harris and Blanck went home. The civil suits filed by families of the dead were settled 2 years later. The settlement was $75 per life. At the time, the average weekly wage for a triangle garment worker was approximately $7. $75 was less than 11 weeks of wages for the workers who had died producing the owner's profits. Adjusted for inflation to 2024, the settlement was approximately $2,300 per life. The insurance settlement Harris and Blanck received for their lost property and machinery exceeded their documented losses by approximately $60,000. Several newspaper accounts noted this arithmetic with varying degrees of restraint. No criminal proceedings related to the insurance claim were initiated. The Triangle Waste Company reopened under a modified name in a different building. Harris and Blanck continued operating in the garment industry. In 1913, a factory inspector visited a facility associated with Max Blanck and found that the exit doors were locked during working hours. This violated legislation that had been passed directly in response to the Triangle fire. Laws written specifically to prevent locked exit doors in factories, signed specifically because of what had happened on March 25, 1911. The fine was $20. Blanck paid it the same day. The $20 fine in 1913 is the part of this story that most accounts skip, because it complicates the preferred ending. The preferred ending is that the fire happened, the public was outraged, reforms followed, and things improved. That ending is accurate as far as it goes, but the $20 fine shows what the system looked like from the inside of it. The cost of locking a door was $20. The cost of changing the door was more than $20. The owner of the factory made the rational economic calculation and arrived at the answer the system produced. The reforms that came from Triangle were genuine and consequential. The Factory Investigating Commission, established in New York in 1911, conducted 4 years of investigations across hundreds of industrial facilities. It produced 36 new labor laws covering fire safety, mandatory sprinklers, exit requirements, working hours for women and children, minimum wages, sanitation standards. The investigators included a state assemblyman named Al Smith and a state senator named Robert Wagner, who spent their subsequent careers building on what the commission found. The legislation New York passed in the 4 years after Triangle set the standard for industrial safety regulation across the country. Francis Perkins, who had stood on the Washington Place sidewalk for those 18 minutes, became the United States Secretary of Labor under Franklin Roosevelt in 1933. She held the position for 12 years, longer than anyone before or since. In those 12 years, she designed or drove through the legislation that forms the foundation of the modern American labor system. The minimum wage, the 40-hour work week, the prohibition on child labor, the Social Security Act, the National Labor Relations Act. She said, in speeches and in her memoir and in interviews through the final years of her life, that the New Deal began on a sidewalk in Greenwich Village on March 25, 1911. She was describing a cause chain. She was saying, this thing happened, and it produced these other things, and those other things changed the conditions under which tens of millions of people work. She was right about the chain. She was also aware, and said so, that the chain had required 146 deaths to begin moving. Perkins was not naive about what the fire had cost. She was precise about it. She did not describe what she had witnessed as a catalyst or a turning point, or any of the words that are used when history needs to make tragedy legible. She said she had watched people die because a door was locked. She said she had spent the rest of her career working on the proposition that no one should die because a door was locked. She was 83 years old when she last spoke publicly about it. She said the image had never left her. She named specific workers she had learned about afterward. She knew their names. She kept a list. Rose Schneiderman, who had led parts of the 1909 strike and had been arrested for it and dismissed by the press as an agitator, spoke at a memorial meeting at the Metropolitan Opera House in April 1911. The audience was large and included wealthy, reform-minded women who had come to express sympathy and discuss what should be done. Schneiderman stood at the podium and told the audience that the workers had been telling them what the conditions were for years. She said that every time workers had organized, the police had come. Every time there had been a picket line, the women on it had been beaten and arrested. She said, precisely and without theatrics, that the only protection that actually worked was the workers' own organized power, meaning union recognition, meaning the right to bargain, meaning the specific things the owners of Triangle had refused to concede in 1909. The audience was quiet. A few people walked out. Most stayed, and in the immediate term, did not act. The union recognition eventually came through legislation and through the organizing that did not stop. It took time. The garment workers' unions became among the most powerful labor organizations in 20th century America. The conditions in the factories improved substantially over the following 2 decades. None of this brought back the 146. The Ash Building is standing. It was designated a New York City landmark in 2003. It is part of New York University and is called the Brown Building. There is a plaque on the exterior wall. The building is otherwise unremarkable. 9 stories of brick with large windows on the upper floors. The windows are the same windows that were in the building in 1911. The building is fireproof. It always was. Every structural element of the Triangle fire story has appeared in the century since. Factories in Bangladesh and Pakistan and Indonesia, in countries where inspection reports go unfiled and fines are cheaper than safety equipment, have produced events with the same architecture. The Rana Plaza building in Dhaka collapsed in 2013. Over 1,100 people died, mostly garment workers, in a building that had visible structural cracks the day before the collapse. The owners had been advised to evacuate. The bank on the ground floor evacuated its employees. The garment factories on the upper floors did not evacuate their workers because the spring orders needed to be filled, and the buyers had deadlines, and the deadlines had penalties attached. The garments were labeled for brands sold in Europe and North America. The spring collections shipped on schedule. Several of the brands issued statements expressing deep concern. One commissioned an independent safety review. The review's recommendations were partially implemented over the following 3 years. The lock in the museum is not behind glass. It is heavy. It is small. The mechanism is a standard pin tumbler design made by the millions in the early 20th century and still made in essentially the same design today. You can look at it and understand exactly how it worked. The cylinder, the pins, the key slot, the spring. You can understand what it would have felt like to push against a door from the inside and encounter the resistance of this mechanism. You can understand, standing next to it, what a door that will not open means in a room that is filling with smoke. There is no interpretation required. There is no history degree required. The object does the entire explanation. A closed lock, a locked door, a stairwell on the other side, a street 30 feet below. The rest follows. Most visitors walk past it. The label is short. The number is 146. The previous video was about a woman they locked up for what she did. Today was about the women they locked in so they could not leave. The next video is about a medicine. It was prescribed for headaches, for pain, for anxiety, for tuberculosis, for insomnia, for the vague category of complaints that doctors in the late 19th century filed under nervous exhaustion, for everything a doctor could think to prescribe it for. It was marketed to physicians as non-addictive. The pharmaceutical company knew this claim was false before the marketing began. The company had internal data showing addiction rates. The data was not published. The medicine made its inventors extraordinarily rich. It addicted a generation of patients who had been told they were taking something safe. It killed more people than the doctors who prescribed it ever counted, in part because those doctors had no mechanism for counting, and in part because they had no incentive to count. The system that produced that outcome was also functioning exactly as designed. The only thing unusual about it was how long it took for anyone to officially notice.